Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. After the derogatory remarks by the top two BJP officials from India that actually garnered not only the international condemnation but also a big backlash coming from within India. Over 204 million Muslim population reacted promptly and strongly against such hurtful remarks given by the top officials from the ruling party, that is Bharatiya Janata Party. Now, rather than understanding the Muslim sentiment and especially the religious sentiment of Muslims that holds very much sensitivity and that love of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Indian authorities showed high-handedness. They launched a crackdown, they demolished the properties, they put the people behind the bars, and we've seen the gut-wrenching scenes emanating from different prisons, from the premises of the different prisons within India, that the detainees are being baton charged under custody. Not only this, to quell these protests, the Indian authorities have declared emergency in different parts of the country. But at the same time, these are turning more violent, and the reaction is rising with every single passing day. Now, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari is in Tehran, and during his talks with his Iranian counterpart, he said these derogatory remarks by the Indian officials have actually garnered and hurt the sentiments of the Muslims across the world. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has also condemned these remarks, and during yesterday's tweet he said that the real face of the democratic India is in front of the world to see. And to talk more about this burning issue that is very sensitive as far as the Muslim sentiment across the globe, not only within India, is concerned, I am joined in the studio by Dr. Ziaul Haq Shamsi, who is an expert of foreign affairs, and he's from Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. And on Skype, I am also joined by Mr. Sami Hamdi, who is MD, the International Interest. He is joining us from London, UK. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Hamdi and Dr. Shamsi. I'll begin the discussion with you, Dr. Shamsi. As we have seen that the protests are turning violent, there is a rise in communal tension within India over the derogatory remarks by the top BJP officials about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Rather than understanding the Muslim sentiment, the Indian authorities are launching a very heavy crackdown, and they are putting the protesters against the behind the bars.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me over on such an important topic. In fact, we need to understand that this is not the first time that communal rights have broken out in India. And this is also not the first time that the way Indian government is handling the protesters. They've always used a very fascist approach against the minorities, particularly the Muslims. What is unique this time is that the remarks are directed upon our beloved Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that is why it has drawn so much across the Muslim world. And perhaps this is for the first time that some of the Islamic countries have reacted more sharply than ever before. Whereas reaction from Pakistan is not as strong as it used to be earlier. What is happening at this time is, and why is the Indian ruling government of BJP is doing it, because three things are in their favor at this time, supposedly. One, that the US-led Western alliance is hell-bent supporting Modi government at any cost. They made them strategic partners in Quad, and they are supporting them all the way in all their endeavors, whether they are political, they are military, or whatsoever. And secondly, there is a very weak opposition inside India by Rahul Gandhi. And that is why Modi government feels emboldened that they can do anything at this time. And with the elections another 2 years' time, they are inciting the people because they are in majority. There is no doubt about it. More than 76% Hindu nationalists are supporting BJP. And with the strong leadership of not only Modi, but in the provincial level also, like Jogi in UP and the other leaders, they want to consolidate this Modi power through the religious sentiments and crush the Muslim community.
So, Dr. Shamsi, do you think that over 204 million population that happens to be Muslims, they would be crushed by such tactics that easily?
You see, the government which is unstoppable at this time by human rights organizations across the globe, other major global players, has no fear. We have seen it during pandemic also. I mean, they did not fear crushing people.
Right, yeah, this is very interesting. But there are certain points, I would take these points to Mr. Hamdi. What do you think? Do you agree with Dr. Shamsi that Indian government led by the BJP, which is of course led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has become emboldened because of a certain fact that the US and its Western alliance wants to help them out, and they have made them the partner in Quad as well? And there is another dimension which I think is that after the revocation of Article 370 and the unilateral and illegal actions in Indian illegally held Kashmir, the Indian authorities were more emboldened in order to crush the Muslim minority population within India itself.
Thank you very much for having me. I think first and foremost it's important to highlight that while it's true that Modi's government has been emboldened in recent times, I think for the first time we finally saw a crack in Modi's approach with regards to his repression of Muslims. For the first time we saw an unprecedented statement released by the BJP that declared that suddenly their BJP, quote, respects all religions, and the BJP also moved to announce the suspension of the two officials that made the derogatory remarks regarding the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The point here being is that Modi for the first time genuinely felt concern, he genuinely felt fear, he genuinely found himself under pressure to scramble in order to try to contain the backlash that was unfolding. Modi genuinely believed that there were consequences that were on the verge of taking place as a result of what had happened, as a result of the comments that were made by a spokesman of the BJP party and a member of parliament in a controversial television interview. The point being is no matter how emboldened Modi felt, the public pressure, the outrage in Pakistan, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirat, in Kuwait, across the Muslim world, this public pressure, this videos that emerged of Muslims saying that they were going to boycott Indian goods in supermarkets, the Indian ambassadors being summoned in Qatar and in Kuwait, the public pressure being so much that even countries in the Gulf that have worked with Modi, that helped to contain or limit Pakistan's options on issues such as Kashmir, that have boosted ties with Modi despite his persecution of Muslims, even these states were forced or pressured into making statements denouncing Modi and making statements that announce the reconsideration of ties with India. And it's important to highlight this because this is a victory for the Muslims in India and also for the Muslim world that has been calling on Modi for justice, that has been calling on Modi to give the rights and to stop the persecution of Muslims. And this is why when we look at the reports that Modi asked Indian embassies in the Muslim world to release statements to the press that the BJP respects all religions, when we look at the hashtag shame on BJP, the hashtag that is by Modi supporters, that Modi supporters were angry with the statement that BJP respects all religions, but Modi ignored those supporters and decided to continue to plea and to go to the Muslim world and say, I had nothing to do with this, please don't punish me. I think this is a victory. The problem, however, is that as a result of this international backlash that has encouraged the Muslims in India, that has made Muslims in India feel like the Muslim world is genuinely with them, that it is part of their body, that they do think about them, the Indian Muslims have been encouraged within India. And this is why Modi is lashing out at them. Modi is seeking to trample them. Modi is terrified that this international backlash has created a momentum such that he might be forced to back down and reconsider his policy of persecution towards Muslims. Modi is terrified of the potential of this momentum that has been created in the Muslim world and this momentum that has encouraged India's Muslims. That's why he's demolishing homes.
Hamdi, do you
That's
think
why he's violently beating them. That's why he's opening live fire.
the kind of tactics the Indian authorities are adopting within India, as you mentioned that Modi is terrified because of the backlash, especially coming from the Muslim world and the Gulf countries in particular, and the people calling out these remarks very promptly and with a huge voice together. But they have also called for boycotting the Indian products. But on the other side, if I go with the line that you have taken, if the authorities had realized the sensitivity and they were really terrified, there should have been some other measures in order to mitigate that very resentment and the anger after these derogatory remarks within India. But rather we see some different pictures emanating from there. There is a huge crackdown. People are being sent behind the bars, their properties being demolished. So that depicts there is no realization among the ranks of the BJP in particular.
The BJP or Modi had a chance to reset relations with the Muslim world or with the Muslims, his own Muslim citizens, when this crisis broke out. In moving to announce a statement that he respects all religions and suspending the two officials, Modi could have used that as a momentum through which to reset relations with his Muslim citizens that he has repressed. But it's important to look at things from Modi's perspective in order to understand his reaction. Remember when when Macron defended the cartoons mocking the beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we saw Gulf countries volunteering to defend Macron, volunteering to justify Macron's draconian measures and crackdown on Muslims. From Modi's perspective, some of the Arab regimes, and I won't mention names here because Pakistan has good ties with some of them, some of the Gulf states, Modi believes that some of these Arab regimes don't really care about these insults, and that the only reason they've made statements is because of the public pressure. And therefore, if he can ride out the public pressure, then these Arab regimes will go back to business as normal with India's Modi and turn a blind eye to Kashmir and turn a blind eye to the repression of Muslim citizens in India. And this is why Modi believes that it's not about resetting relations with Muslims, it's about silencing them, making them quiet, terrifying them, striking fear in their hearts, trying to get them to shut up so that the Arab regimes can go back to business as normal. Modi knows that the condition for restoring relations with some of these Arab regimes, I won't mention their names, the condition for restoring relations is to get the public pressure to go away, and he believes that to make the public pressure go away, he has to get the Indian Muslims to be quiet, but the Indian Muslims are encouraged because of the support they're receiving internationally in the international condemnation. They're much louder now, so Modi is lashing out. He's using force to try to get them to be quiet so that the public pressure goes away. So these states that defended Macron's crackdown on Muslims, that worked against Pakistan on Kashmir, that worked against when Imran Khan was prime minister, worked against his efforts to push back against Islamophobia. Modi knows these states with which he has a lot of trade with which he has a lot of investments from. Modi believes that he can go business as usual with these relations if he can remove the public pressure.
Right, your point is well taken, Mr. Hamdi. Dr. Shamsi, do you agree with Mr. Hamdi that Modi wants to go back to the normal as far as the business with the Gulf countries in particular is concerned? That's why he wants that public pressure that has mounted over the last couple of weeks to subside, and he wants to get away with that.
Actually, humbly speaking, I tend to disagree with him, because my argument is that this pressure is not enough to calm down a person like Modi, who is a Hitler. He was declared by former Prime Minister of Pakistan. And he has been tackling these situations for the last 8 years at the helm of the affairs in India. And he knows that the pressures are built up around him. He crushes them, and then the pressure subsides. We have seen the same in the case of Kashmir, 5th August, and we have seen this in the case of Hindu temple, we have seen in the case of Babri Masjid, we've seen n number of cases. And my argument is that why is Palestine and Kashmir not achieved their objectives for the past 7 decades? Only because we in the Muslim world think that a day-long protest or 7-day-long protest or these condemnations and all would be enough to cow down the countries like Israel or India. That is not going to happen unless the Western world supports these protests and Western world condemns them.
Dr. Shamsi, there was a report on the overall affairs of human rights in South Asia in particular, and there was a mention of India as well. And then we saw Mr. Jake Sullivan and Mr. Anthony Blinken speaking about the human rights violations which are happening in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, as well as the suppression of the Muslim minority within India. So do you think that sort of a condemnation or pinpointing to what exactly the state of affairs happened to be in India as far as treatment towards Muslims is concerned, was that sufficient?
No, sir. That's what I'm saying. Not sufficient, not enough. To cow down a person like Modi, who is fascist and he doesn't care about anybody except his own rule. And that is what he's been surrounded with, like a person like Jogi and others. What I'm saying is that has any Muslim country recalled its ambassador from India? I have not seen in the press. Has Modi come under this pressure and come on the national television and apologize to the Muslims? No. If he has, then I have missed it. So what I am suggesting is that this pressure is not enough and we need to build it up more, and perhaps a lot of sacrifice would be needed.
I'll come back to this point. What sort of sacrifices the Muslim world or the leaders in particular need to actually make at this point in time in order to impress upon Narendra Modi in particular, in order to avoid and mitigate such type of things and not to let such type of things happen. Now, Mr. Hamdi, as you have heard Dr. Shamsi saying that this pressure is not enough, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi didn't happen to speak about what happened after these derogatory remarks were hurled by his party officials. Only suspension and one expulsion from the party. Do you think that gives us a sense of the realization, especially when it comes to Narendra Modi as the Prime Minister, given the sensitivity of the matter?
I think it's important to put things into context. The reality is that, as my honorable guest has alluded to, he is correct in that there has been a lack of action on the part of a number of Muslim states. But it's equally important to stress that the reaction of the Muslim states was not because most of the leaders suddenly turned around and said, "Wallahi, I feel insulted." It was because they saw the people were insulted and were worried about the backlash from the people that might turn on them as well for not taking a stance. This is a movement that is being pushed by the ordinary Muslim, not by states. And states are reacting to that mood. And this is why I think that the statement that was made by Modi's party, by the BJP, that they scrambled to release, in that they suddenly respect all parties, that's a climb down. That's something that's been forced out of the BJP. The reason the BJP supporters are angry with that is because they believe that respecting Islam or respecting all religions is contrary to the BJP identity. So Modi is feeling that pressure. That pressure is clear. That pressure is tangible. We can see that pressure is being manifested, and this is just one of the victories that has been achieved as a result of the public pressure that is taking place. What you do with that public pressure is a different issue. I agree with what the honorable guest said in his first intervention when he said the reality is that some of the leaders who used to lead from the front on these issues are no longer in power, and those who have replaced them are perhaps not necessarily as interested in these issues as perhaps their predecessors were. The reality is that the Muslim world is lacking leadership on these issues. But what this situation has demonstrated is that the Muslim conscience is very much alive. The reality is that while it's true the reaction towards the occupation of Kashmir was not as strong, what is happening now is a greater awareness of what is taking place in India. And the point that I want to make is this: while we may believe that it is not enough, it is something that Modi is worried about. If Modi wasn't worried about it, he would not be trying to
Mr. Hamdi, your point is well taken. Beg your pardon for the interruption. I am now joined by another guest in the show, Mr. Kamran Yousaf, who is a senior journalist. Mr. Yousaf, thank you very much for your time at Views on News. So we are discussing the backlash over the derogatory remarks about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam by BJP officials. One of them was expelled and one's membership was suspended from the party. Do you think that reaction from the BJP top authority was sufficient in order to mitigate the kind of ripple effect it had created among not only Muslims from around the globe, but also at home?
I think it is not sufficient. It appears that those decisions taken by the ruling BJP were just mere eyewash, because given the fact that on one hand, as you pointed out, that they expelled one BJP leader, the other, the national spokesperson of the BJP, was suspended. But we have seen that the same leaders, even on social media statements doing rounds, that they were saying that the leadership, the BJP leadership, even the former spokesperson of the BJP was saying that even Prime Minister Narendra Modi expressed full support to her. So it appears that the action taken by the BJP was just to appease or pacify, the growing anger, not just in the Muslim world, but particularly in the Gulf countries. The reason for that is because India understands that if a relationship with the Gulf deteriorates, that can have really negative impact on the economy. So I believe that those actions taken, one, by the BJP were not sufficient. And secondly, I don't think so that they were really sincere in, taking action against those officials. Those were, I believe, just to hoodwink, the Muslim world.
Right. Mr. Yousaf, on one side, when we saw the calls for the arrest of those two BJP officials, there were many voices coming from within India, especially from the BJP ranks, dubbing those two leaders as brave and nationalist. Don't you think that sort of comment coming from within the party ranks, who is ruling the so-called largest democracy in the world, adds fuel to fire?
Absolutely. And I think we need to understand, this is not an isolated event. Initially, if you see when the Qatari government summoned the Indian envoy to protest and lodge a formal protest over these derogatory remarks, the statement put out by the Indian embassy in Doha said that those officials were fringe elements, meaning that this kind of view was not held by the BJP or the larger society. But that is not true. I think those both officials who made those derogatory remarks are part of the BJP and the RSS ideology, and they were actually representing the view of by and large majority of the BJP. So in that sense, certainly I think that India or the BJP cannot hide behind this fact that this was just an isolated event. This is ongoing, the process.
Of course, there is a long list of the Islamophobic incidents that actually discriminate against the Muslim minority in India, that include the hijab ban in February and then the subsequent protests after that. Then we saw the statements coming from BJP in order to eliminate Muslims and save India from them. And then there was a controversial Citizenship Act. There are a number of other legislations which actually deemed to marginalize and discriminate against Muslims. Now, Mr. Hamdi, when you talk about that there is a sense of realization, especially when it comes to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there is a statement by the BJP spokesperson, Mr. Tom Wadakhan, if I am pronouncing him right. He said that these protests were part of an orchestrated program with the specific game plan. So they're not even ready to accept that these protests are happening indigenously, and there is no outside support and there is no agenda coming from any country, because there were certain officials from BJP who were mentioning the name of Bangladesh, and there are certain people who are hinting at the name of other countries. So do you agree with this statement? And when you take the line that there is a realization among the BJP ranks, so after that, such statements coming from the spokesperson of BJP don't go. It's in a huge contradiction with that.
Narendra Modi realized that the statements that were made by the officials compromised India's economic interest abroad. 70% of India's oil comes from the Gulf. 40% of natural gas comes from the Gulf. When we look at the remittances that go into India every year, it's more than $60 billion comes from the Gulf alone. What Modi realized is that the backlash from these comments, or rather what Modi realized, was that not everything that happens in India stays in India. Modi believed that his prejudice and his repression of Muslims in India would be just an Indian issue and would not be an issue that would concern the international mood. The reality is this is the first time in which he's seen a genuine international backlash to his statements. The Indian vice president was in Doha during the time of the incident. The Qataris on the same day announced they would cancel the state dinner with the vice president. The India's ambassadors were being summoned. Oman, with whom India has comprehensive security agreements that help India to protect its interests in the ocean. The reality is, or the Mufti of Oman called for a boycott, and the Omani ambassador or the Indian embassies were being asked by the Omanis and by the Kuwaitis and the Qataris to explain themselves. Modi realized that his Islamophobia, that his repression of the Muslims was suddenly causing a risk to India's economic interest. But the second realization that Modi made is that in his view, he doesn't need to appease the Muslim citizens to escape this crisis. He doesn't need to give them their rights. Modi's second realization is that these officials, I need to appease the outside world. I need to give lip service outside and say that I'm suspending the officials. They won't check if the officials are suspended. I need to go outside and say to them that I respect all religions. But inside India, I don't need to do that.
Mr. Hamdi, this is a very important point that you have just raised. This is very interesting and important point, Mr. Hamdi, you have raised. I'll take this point to Dr. Shamsi. As you have just heard Mr. Hamdi saying that it's the appeasement of the officials of the foreign countries, especially when it comes to the trade ties with the Gulf countries. It's not about the appeasement or catering to the sentiment of the Muslim population within India.
So that means he himself is saying that Modi is not realizing the pain of the Muslims and the Muslims across the world. I wish Mr. Hamdi is right, but I am afraid this is not the case. Because this is not the first time, as you have already enumerated all the incidents. This is fitna. This is fitna. It is created, orchestrated and launched at regular intervals, 2 to 3 months, just to see the reaction of the people inside India and outside India. Sometimes the reaction is little stronger and sometimes it is not as strong, and the government, the BJP government can digest that. This time it is apparently little stronger than normal, but that does not mean that Modi will accept his fault and take corrective measures. No, he will try to calm down the situation, and after 2 months another fitna will rise.
Okay, there is another development. Dr. Shamsi, on Monday, the Delhi High Court called for action against hate speech by elected representatives. Now, this is some sort of a different voice coming from within India, and especially from the judicial system in India. It also goes on to say that it is against the hate speech by the elected representatives, political and religious leaders, emphasizing that such utterances are the beginning point of attacks against the targeted community. So we see some sort of a realization, at least in one certain quarter of that society, which is actually led by BJP. And there are certain voices coming from Congress and the opposition parties as well, that the demolition and the crackdown against Muslim minority is not justified. It is unconstitutional, and the government is trying to use unconstitutional measures in order to quell those protests.
I think decision on scarf and veil are not that old now. Decision on Babri Masjid is also not that old and cannot be forgotten. So it is the same court, but I do not want to pass any judgment on Indian court. It is their system and the way they are doing. I wish it is on the right lines to pacify the feelings of the Muslims at that time, at this time. However, the person on the top who instigates, who supports and who sponsors it is not realizing. In case like Mr. Hamdi is saying that the Indian business interests are being hurt, I don't think so. India is such a big market that it will create its opportunities all by itself. And all those countries who are trying to just boycott the Indian products, it is peanuts.
Okay, so I'll come back to this very aspect of whether India can create its own market while not depending upon the Gulf states from which its 65% crude oil need is met. Now, Mr. Yousaf, what do you think about this statement coming from the Delhi High Court? It depicts that there is some sort of realization in one element of that government functionary.
I think we have to understand India is a huge country and they have a diverse opinion. And there are voices within India, even from Congress and other politicians, journalists, and other critics, who are openly talking about the wrong direction that the country, the India, has taken over the past few years, particularly under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Certainly, there are voices, but the problem is that those voices, I believe, at the moment, are so fragmented or so divided that they cannot actually force the current government to change their policy. The reason for this is, look at when BJP or Prime Minister Modi first came to power, that he pursued, those policies. And because of those policies, he was even given a bigger mandate in the next election. So this means that even majority of the population and even the BJP believes that the kind of policies, communal politics that they play, actually, that politics is paying dividends. So when a political party see that opportunity, then why would they change, their approach? The only way that India can change its course if there is a counter narrative, if there is a strong political force within India that can come up and restore some kind of pride, because India obviously claims to be a secular country, but of course that we have seen in recent years that how it has actually undermined its credentials. So yes, there are voices within India who are critical of the current Indian government's policies, but I believe that more needs to be done before this really madness stopped.
Right, Mr. Hamdi, what do you think after this statement by the Delhi High Court, and given the record of the judicial system in India, and especially when it comes to the cases against the Muslim minority, whether it be the demolition of Babri Mosque or there are certain other verdicts which come apparently against the Muslims, do you think there is a realization among the ranks of judiciary over this particular incident?
I don't think there's necessarily realization on the part of the judiciary. The judiciary has upheld much of Modi's repression against the Muslims. I think what the realization is that what happens in India doesn't stay in India, and that there can be repercussions if India or if Modi is not careful in how he contains the spread of news outside of India. I think the reaction of Modi on this occasion is solely because the backlash was international and because India's economy still relies heavily on the Gulf. The reality is that if we're looking about India's potential to diversify, let's remember that Biden, the president of the United States of America, who promised to make bin Salman a pariah, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is now being forced into visiting Riyadh and going to bin Salman and resetting relations. The point being that it's not that easy to diversify away from the Gulf. What Modi panicked in the beginning was that these relations might be compromised. The realization is not that I should treat Muslims better. The realization is that there are potential costs to my Islamophobia and crushing of Muslim citizens, and therefore I should control the flow of information. And this is why I think that when it comes to what's happening inside India, it's important to look at it in terms of what is actually happening. For the first time, we're seeing Modi, who never used to give any regard for any sentiments of the Muslim world. We've seen an unprecedented statement from the BJP saying they respect all religions. They don't, but the fact that they had to release this statement knowing it would upset their supporters shows that Modi felt under pressure, shows that Modi is worried about something. We have to appreciate this. Secondly, the Indian Muslims, the Muslims in India themselves, in their protests, in their defiance, they themselves are saying that they are encouraged by the reaction of the Muslim world. They are acknowledging that that reaction is encouraging them, and that is also what is causing concern for Modi. The reality is that we should give due weight to these realities. These are progress. This is development. This is something that should be applauded in the fight against repression in India. It's not something that we should undermine. It's something we should build upon, even if the regimes don't choose to do so. The final point is this. The reaction of the Muslim world or the reaction of the Muslim regimes is because of the Muslims, the ordinary Muslims. When
Right,
that public
right.
pressure is lifted, the regimes will try to restore relations. It's important we keep up the pressure, and the reality is what's happening in India is
Mr.
unprecedented.
Hamdi,
We've
you are
never
of the
seen
view
Modi
that
back
Muslim
down
world
and
should
say
keep
he
up the
respects
pressure.
all religions.
When
This
you
is a
talk
victory.
about that it's not easy for India to find the alternate partners when it comes to trade and economic relations, and of course, you mentioned that over 70% of the crude oil need is coming from the Middle East. There is over $100 billion bilateral trade volume between India and the Gulf countries. And there is a huge workforce from India that is residing in the Gulf countries that send back home a huge chunk of remittances as well. So if that is not possible, do you think this is the time for the Muslim countries, especially the Gulf countries, after we saw that from the platform of OIC, International Day Against Islamophobia was declared, that was led by Pakistan. Do you think this is that very point in history where these Gulf countries need to realize, and at least, as Dr. Shamsi already mentioned, that they need to bring back their ambassadors, and rather than only lodging a strong protest and condemnation, they should consider severing the trade relations with India as well? Mr. Hamdi, please go ahead.
Apologies, sorry. The
Do
question was for
you
me.
think it's possible for the Gulf countries to consider severing?
Have huge potential to really punish Modi over what is taking place. I think that the Gulf states do have a responsibility towards the Muslim world. Whether they will actually do so is a different question. The reality is that we saw over the past 4 years that when Pakistan tried to push on these issues to pressure Modi, it was some of the Gulf states, too, in particular, that heavily resisted Pakistan's attempts. When it came to Kashmir and pressuring Modi on Kashmir, 2 Gulf states heavily pressured Pakistan and limited Pakistan's options. The reality is that there are 2 Gulf states in particular that are very keen to rehabilitate Modi and will not use this potential to punish Modi. But it's also important to highlight that these 2 Gulf states have issued statements condemning Modi, issued statements that they did not want to issue. They issued it only because of public pressure. They issued it
because of the public pressure. Mr. Yousaf, do you think at this point in history, Mr. Hamdi, your point is well taken. Mr. Yousaf, do you think it's possible at this point in history that the Gulf countries not only giving statements of condemnation against these derogatory remarks, they have any sort of capacity to sever or even consider severing those trade relations with India?
I don't think so that is going to happen, because the problem is that, the Gulf countries and India have, their economic interests so interlinked. So I don't think so that is possible in the near future. Of course, there is a lot of resentment when you talk about the public in the Muslim world, particularly in the Arab countries, and we have seen that many trends have, emerged after, this incident in those Arab countries. So the public sentiment is certainly there against India very much, but I don't think so that given the larger economic interest that both sides enjoy, we can see some very drastic measures. But of course, that it is a wake-up call for India, because earlier India thought that whatever they could do, they could easily get away with it, because even if we recall that when India unilaterally revoked the special status of disputed Jammu and Kashmir on the 5th of August 2019, and it is an open secret that Pakistan did not get the kind of support that they should have from the Arab countries. Even the OIC could not convene an exclusive meeting of foreign ministers to discuss this particular issue. The very reason was that these Arab countries really preferred their economic interests over, the issues of human rights facing Kashmiris and even the Muslims elsewhere in India. But of course, that this time around, certainly certain red lines have crossed. So it is, in a way, a good beginning that at least that these Arab countries have started speaking up against this Hindutva ideology. But I don't think so that they can go to the extent of severing diplomatic or economic ties with India.
So, Mr. Yousaf, if the public pressure keeps on mounting, as we have seen in the case of Kuwait, the people were seen taking the Indian products away from their shelves in the superstores and the markets. So, if that public pressure continues to mount, do you think it would goad those authorities in the Gulf states to think on different lines in order to deal with India?
I think that is important. I think if there is a public pressure, and of course that if India does not mend its ways and these incidents continue, certainly that will, put pressure on the Arab leaders to go really tough on India, not just issuing condemnation statements, but take some tangible actions. So certainly there is a possibility, but I think that given the fact that now that Arab countries and the Gulf countries have considerable economic leverage over India, so even without severing diplomatic ties, even without severing, economic ties, they can use that leverage to persuade India to change, their policies. Because we have to also understand, we have to be realistic, that India is a huge country and India is a huge market. And I don't think so that any country really wants to ignore that fact. So the best scenario in this case is that these powerful countries and these Arab countries use their economic leverage, really to persuade India to change its policies. And if that happens, I think that will be a win-win situation.
Mr. Kamran Yousaf, senior journalist, thank you very much for being at the show. We really appreciate your time. And Dr. Ziaul Shamsi, expert foreign affairs from Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Thank you very much for your time, for joining in the studio at the show. And Mr. Sami Hamdi joining us from London, UK on Skype. Thank you very much for your time as well. So we had an in-detail discussion regarding what is happening to the Muslims in India. The Muslim minority is being crushed. They have been put behind the bars when they have protested, and their freedom of expression has been denied, and their freedom of assembly has been denied. And not only they are being put behind the bars, their properties are also being demolished. And that is portraying a very dismal picture of the so-called largest democracy in India, that in the world, that happens to be India. And with that note, we come to the end of today's Views on News. Thank you for being with us.